really got to know each other well. And then I actually was fortunate enough to sign on with his design co-op, United Designers, after the course, which is a co-op of designers all around the world that bring projects together and then collaborate on the projects. And so there's so much regenerative work going on around the world. And it's been so amazing to be part of this co-op that Dan has created, to see all of the good going on and be a part of it. And so I'm just really excited for you guys to get to know Dan and get to see all of the amazing work going on in the world. And it just gives me so much hope for our future. So I hope that you guys are as inspired by I am by what he's working on and doing. So, Dan, are you there?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm kind of dark here. I got to get in front of the light to make this change. Great to be here, and thank you for the invitation through Kelly to do this presentation to you. And it's been great working with Kelly and our other designers with United Designers. It's been around for about 4 years as we started focusing on team design for our solutions for ecological restoration, homestead design, permaculture design, all that. We really do focus on dividing up, you might say, and dividing and multiplying our skills so that our clients get faster service, a broader source of resources, and also a science-based solutions that are site-specific to whatever their purpose is. And with Kelly and the other designers, we're working in India, Haiti, Pakistan, Senegal, all over the world. I've been fortunate, actually pre-COVID, to travel greatly and having a great time doing that and seeing some of the greatest issues, you might say, across the globe in Europe and Asia and Africa. And through that have learned a great amount from the local people, from reading research papers, which is for most people not a hobby, but I kind of appreciate that, and have access to USDA and Agricola and all these other different research paper databases to find out the information that we need to make good decisions. So United Designers is based on science design, and also working with each other to make sure that our information is correct. And we have a lot of eyes looking at the work to make sure that it's done well. And as you'll see, we're very much a graphical-based organization, even though we have the science and the papers and the narrative as part of that. A lot of what we work with really is making sure that it's easily read and that our designs can be communicated easily between groups, and also knowing that the people that we work with are usually responsible to other people. So they need to be able to explain these complex solutions or strategies also, and that's what we focus on, is clear and concise communication, and also principles and ethics and strategies that our clients can use in their design work and going forward and make good decisions. So today what I'd like to do is bring to you a number of concepts in the time that we have of how we work with this, and basically creating and regenerating natural capital on the landscape, how we bring this together for our clients, and then also some of the issues and perspectives that we're working with based on ecological restoration, but also some principles that we like to say that are scalable. One of the things from permaculture that I learned long ago, that all the solutions need to be scalable. And if you can't scale it, then there's an issue with that. And what I'm finding, as you'll see, is a lot of the small scale work that we do on homesteads, actually those same principles work on larger problems and larger issues in the ecology. And I really much enjoy that, and actually communicating that with people as we kind of help make the decision process a little bit easier by having some basic principles of what ecological systems need, natural capital needs, and also, like we like to say, raising the carrying capacity of the planet, along with all the projects that we work on too. Usually there is, sorry, it's funny, I got to keep moving in front of that light there so I get in the shadow. Usually a lot of the questions are kind of held towards the end of some of the presentations. And when I'm teaching, also I encourage people to raise their hands in the midst of any conversation, because we want to make sure that issues get addressed right away if something's not clear. And sometimes, of course, information out there that might not be, just from my experience. as far as how things work and scientific terms, things like that. So Kelly is going to field the questions out of the chat, and then when she's finding something that needs to be explained, she'll just kind of flag me down or interrupt me, which is just fine, during the presentation. So we're going to cover a lot of different topics, strategies, and things like that, and also travel a little bit to kind of see what's going on in these other areas. But I'm trying to focus greatly on agroforestry as a tool or a strategy for really helping with the local climate, our larger global climate, and what the effects are of the work that we do, all the way from cooling the soils and cover crops up to the forests that need to be built or rebuilt or reforested in areas to help the local climates, rainfall and such, and those things happen. So we'll get started with that. Sound good, Kelly? There you go. Okay. So I'm going to share a screen here, and we'll get going. So again, clean my screen here. So one of the things that I really want to focus on too is that we are a group of designers that work together with United Designers, and all of our experience all over traveling, kind of a global perspective on our issues, but also each person in our group is an expert in their area, whether Kelly, where she's traveled to, or living in Colorado, other people that live in Europe, the Netherlands, the Northwest, the Southwest, Brandon, who lives in Seattle, or Mike, who lives out in Washington, D.C. Everybody has their area that they're working in, but we all work with generally the same principles as we work together. And I'm just going to get started into this because there's a lot of things I want to cover and want to show, and it helps kind of with the conversation too. And also, because these presentations are generally distributed, sometimes I don't want to read the text on the slide. I don't, and you probably too don't like that very much. But I put it on there so that people can have that in reference when these things get distributed later. But a lot of the large scale work that we're doing now in stream bed restoration, watershed restoration, a lot of times are still using the same principles that we use on landscapes, homesteads, things like that. And so I want to show a lot of little examples and case studies for that. This little picture on the right, first of all, right off the bat, is where I was working in Alabama. This beautiful stream running through the property of the owners there. And what you see on the right is just the slightest, tiniest little one rock dam, if you're familiar with those. And Rushka actually was a design partner and co-founder of United Designers, was visiting in Alabama. And we built this, and all we did was put a few rocks across from there's a trunk on the far right that had exposed roots. And they said, let's put some rocks here and see what happens. And you can see there, in one storm, in one rain event, all that silt was deposited right behind that tiny little dam. It covered the roots of the trees, and this is kind of the strategy of one rock dams. And then as that gets built up, you keep adding more and more, and you keep slowly building these dams up, check dams, to basically catch the silt and help with the stream bed and actually clean the water as we go. And I was just so amazed with one event how much of that silt built up behind that tiny little dam, right? And now as we go across and we keep building that, you can see the landscape behind it. It's a very gentle slope, but it also is an opportunity to rock armor the sides of that stream, and it's flowing all the time. And then when we do have the big rains, the extreme rains down there, these little one rock dams are very stable, and they do a lot of great work. The hydrology of the landscape is very important to us. That's where we first start. When we're starting to do agroforestry, farming, whatever it is, we look at the hydrology, we look at the watershed, and we have to really start with that because water is always the issue. And water is where the land is usually suffering from overcutting, clear cutting, or farming, or whatever it might be. And we start with that to help get our carrying capacity up and start building our natural capital. Another thing that happens too is that soil protection and foliage is super important. Everything from the garden, and I was just talking to one of my clients yesterday about putting straw down in their garden and protecting the soil. I was in southern Minnesota earlier this week where the soil is so rich and black, And if you don't cover it up, you can imagine the temperature of that soil, how high it gets. And we've had a lot of situations with that. This picture on the right is this is in Senegal, a sheep fence, Red Brand, is one of my favorite brands, sheep fence there, shipped in, and then T-posts. And we basically surrounded this 30 acres with sheep fence to keep out all the goats, all the local goats, and all of a sudden you can see within 6 months, all of the soil cover just from tree leaves. From the left side where we're keeping the goats out and all the cattle, to the right side where everything is chewed up. All the leaves are removed from the bottom of the trees. The animals eat all the dry leaves, almost like potato chips. But in this case, immediately as we start to cover the soil, we are lowering the soil temperature and we are helping the plants, and we are starting to build resources in the ground, whether it be from mycelium or whatever. As soon as we can cover it, and this is like beach sand, this area, as soon as we can start covering it, we're going to be raising that organic material and the water carrying capacity of the soil. So everything that we can do to basically diminish the extremes of the outside of where we're working, because the larger landscape is always affecting what we're doing. And many times we have to keep out invasive plants, invasive animals, all those kinds of things, even the riparian buffers and keeping out sprays on farms, things like that. Usually there needs to be a border of some kind to protect the land from outside influences. Let's just say negative outside influences, because there's a lot of good ones too. This is an example of, this was also in Senegal when we were there doing a class with farmers, showing them the difference between mulching, how they can reduce their irrigation water that's necessary, and what happens when you do that. In Minnesota, where I am, and we did this on my farm also, 2 inches under the ground in the bare soil was 110 degrees. And you can imagine what that's doing to the root zone. So covering the soil, ground covers, mulching, whatever, is really important. But again, scaling up, this is the same thing that happens from forests. This is the same thing that happens with shrubs and ground covers and things like that on a larger scale. So in this case, that temperature is probably right on the soil surface, down a little ways, up a little ways. Obviously, it's getting warmer as you get up to you might say even the atmosphere through the mulch. This is the same properties that we look at using in forestry, that we can get condensation like this ground cover will do. There will be condensation in the morning, and that will help keep the ground moist. Same thing as a forest that's 100 feet tall, the same. And that's what I'm always amazed when I work on homesteads and then I go work on a restoration area. The principles apply in scale in every situation that we're working on. Activist from years ago, and he hired me to come there and help them with their work in working on the land and trying to figure out where they are. 58,000 acres 150 years ago was sold to a private organization away from the local people. They were trying to get it back. I think it was $230 million it was priced at, but now it's up for sale. I know that's down to about $100 million. But the local people are trying to raise the money so they could buy their island back, as absurd as that sounds. But in this case, over the years, what has happened is the topsoil has been eroded away. They've also, as in sense, now that they've lost their ground cover, and through crops and through cattle and you name it, what's happened on this land is that basically the native soils have also washed away. And guess what? Where did they wash? They washed into the reefs. So what did they do? They covered the reefs. What did they do? They killed the reefs, right? So using the land as it was also affected fishing and affected the lifestyle of all the people on the island. And so what we're trying to do now, of course, once they can get control of their land back, is to decrease the soil temperature by bringing in the crops, bringing in the grasses back in, which there are a lot of natives, increase the infiltration, and I'll show some pictures here to raise the water table. And also, not so much here in Molokai, but you might have heard a lot of the wells on coastal towns are being filled now with salt water because the cities and the wells are being extracted faster than the rainwater can infiltrate. And the rainwater going in the ground into the water table is what pushes the salt water out and keeps the salt water out of the wells. In Beirut, in Ibiza, and other areas of the world, actually, the wells are now filling water because they're extracting the rainwater too quickly, or I should say the water table too quickly, and because they're covered now with hardscapes and everything, all the fresh water just gets put out into the ocean as opposed to into the ground. A very big problem in all these areas. When an area is denuded like this, you don't have grasses and you don't have trees covering it and roots, the water just washes away into the soil, with the soil, into the creeks, into the lakes, all those kinds of places, and causes a great amount of problem. So this is an example of what that landscape looks like in that area. And one of the issues we have, of course, if you don't have the soils for the native plants, you don't have the native soils, how are you going to grow native plants? So we have to basically start over to rebuild that, and I'll show some examples of that too. So this is a map from West Molokai, and the 58,000 acres that are kind of see a little bit of the work that we're planning, and this is the restoration side. And talking about an abundance culture is what we're trying to build here. Off of the map to the right is where the town of Kunakakai is, and that's where a lot of the locals live, because they can't live on this third of their island on the left side because it's privately held. But as they get it back and as they're doing this work, you can imagine we also need to get people on the landscape. So the yellow there are all the features that we want to do in order to keep the water, infiltrate the water, get it in the ground, and help create that water table now in a very dry side of the island. This is after the mountains from the westerly rainforest. And so after the rainforest have kind of taken all the water out of the sky, this area is very dry. So collecting water as much as possible, another repeating strategy that we have to do in a lot of the projects, get the water, keep the water, disperse it, distribute it, try and put it around somewhere where you can get it in the ground will help the water take all the plants there too. So we're having a lot of strategies here in order to keep the water, because that's where we have to start and putting it on the land. At the same time, we basically have to kind of divide it up socially, right? And cooperatively, what are the different areas of this land going? How are they going to be used? Because we have thousands of people that will probably move on to this property using their culture and their structure and their organization. And in Hawaii, actually, watersheds divide up the properties. So a watershed used to be the village's area, from the top of the mountains, the ridges, all the way down. The area that fed your river, your creek, whatever it might be, was your land, and you were responsible for that. So watershed management is very important in their culture. And so in this sense, we're kind of dividing up the land that way also for residential areas, cultural areas where people will live, and then also create more habitat for the different areas. So you can see conservancy preserve, botanical and habitat preserve. On the steepest areas that aren't suitable for living or aren't suitable for any kind of agriculture, those areas are basically put into preserves for animals and also plant life. This is one example of what they did in Molokai. It's berming, and we do a lot of berm and swales and permaculture in our design work, but on these flat plains and on these floodplain areas where the water is being taken away, these areas are being bermed up on contour to collect the rainfall. And you'll see every once in a while in these walls, there'll be a little area where the water flows over, and those areas are cut in the wall. So actually we don't want the wall to overtop. And so we have a level sills, spillways cut into these so that the water can collect, and at a certain height, it spills into the next area so that we don't have overtopping and then erosion. We have kind of basically areas that are armored with stone and grasses so the water can overflow. A lot of this, you see these in Arizona, you see these in New Mexico from the 30s, and what a great effect they've had in the desert. This same strategy is used all over the world. Catch the water, infiltrate the water, create basins, create swales, so the water can go on the ground and then feed the land for a lot longer than just the rains. And also that helps with the grasses. After a number of months of these are built, you can already see how the grasses are coming in on the top where they were planted to stabilize the berms, and then also starting to fill in behind in the area where it floods. So a long-term decision on here, a short-term really amount of work when you think about the decades that these will be there, but the effect of it will last for generations. I was working with the Society for Ecological Restoration for a while, doing presentations and working on some of the committees there. And this is one of their charts that they had, and I'm a graphical person, so I kind of reinterpreted it here, talking about trajectory of the ecosystem status. And this is also how we think of how we're working. On a time scale of where the succession goes and how the plants move, there has to be really an acceptable range of what you expect to happen. So in our design process, we're thinking these are the species that we want to put in there. Here's what we'd like to see happen. And then over each season, depending upon the season where you are, again, being site specific, measure what's happening. What are the density of the plants? How many new plants do we have? Did we have any things die? And then at that point, you have your areas where things are acceptable, and then we have to do an adjustment. So we always think of our design work as a trajectory for the ecosystem, not a solution, not an answer. That's going to come over time, and we're going to have to learn this specific area and what the responses are to what we're doing. So in that sense, over a time scale, our role is the fact as practitioners that we actually don't do the work. We set up the culture, we set up the conditions, and then we have to watch the cycles and the flows of the ecology and see how it responds, and then we adjust. We're not expecting the ecosystem to adjust to us. We're expecting the ecosystem to respond to what we do, and then we adjust in our practices and our strategies to help direct it to a stable state, and hopefully a rich state where things can take over, and then we can change the hydrology, and we can basically get the forest back on track in its natural sort of succession. Now, here's a project in Iraq, and this is now on a smaller scale, of course, and you can see the before and after installation. This is a number of months in planning, of course, and this is for a refugee camp, actually, a production area for a refugee camp there. So the original fields were just flat fields with tons of irrigation pipe, none of which was working for many reasons. And in this sense, what we're trying to do again is collect water. And you can see in the lower left picture and the right picture in the lower left corner, those are called the garum pits. Those are basins. And in the middle of the basin is like a little island, and that's where we plant fruit trees and shrubs. This is another way of collecting water. Down in the upper right corner of that picture, you'll see we have the swales, the berms, and we're doing alley cropping, really focusing on getting the trees started in those areas so that they have some shade. We also have some windbreaks, but also multiple areas and multiple levels of production based on tree crops, shrub crops, perennials, things like that, and then their annual gardens in between. You can see immediately how more green is coming into this area. We're collecting more water. We're putting it in the ground. We're also adding to this, which isn't pictured, cisterns. And just as a note, I'm a big fan of getting as many people involved. I'm not really automation. When we're talking about some of these areas where you don't have clean water, you don't have filtration, you don't have county water coming in or a really clean well, is that we build cisterns and we hand water to get started. And we really encourage a lot of the people to hand water their crops so that people are in the field at the time and watching the plants, and then everybody learns and everybody gets a handle on how things are working. And then once the trees are established and the forest is established, now we have our organic material coming off for trimming, and we can use that organic material in building compost and building the soil. So you can see a number of strategies going here. The Zaya pits are the little holes in many areas where we plant, and I'll show some of those. And then the garum pits are for the trees, and those are basins that collect water, kind of like ground tanks. One of the things, thinking of trajectory and how things work, soon after this was put in the fall, they had a huge snowstorm and freezing temperatures. And of course, everything froze up, and the garum pits actually froze up with ice and water, which is something that we didn't anticipate there where we were in Iraq, but had to make adjustments there. And a lot of those pits in the lower left corner were actually then connected by channels. So they could actually share water, and water could move across the landscape rather than ponding up in a way that it was actually very detrimental to the trees because the water got so deep and froze so far. This is kind of the strategy that we had there. You can see the Nagarin pit there in the center. In many cases where it's sand, we're not mulching with compost, anything like that, because sand breathes. The respiration of sand soils is so frequent that it basically just burns up the organic material very quickly. So we're using sticks, rocks, anything we find that can go on there. And basically with a sand ecology, you might say, in the soil, we're really depending on mycelium, and we're depending on a thick layer of wood chips and branches and other things that are slowly rotting away. And that's where the nutrients are then slowly washed into the soil. If you try to do that with compost or straw or mixing it in, it's not like clay. The sand will just eat it up and burn it up. It goes away very quickly. Also, you see the little goats in there. And just as a note, too, I've heard this from a soil pathologist that I was working with for a while. And he said specifically, within all of these systems, you have to have some kind of animal in the system within 3 years. It's the animal manure in their bacteria in their gut that actually keeps the soil healthy from the bacteria that's in their gut and diminishes the pathogens and the diseases in soil. And I thought that was very interesting. Goats, cattle, sheep, he said, doesn't matter what it is, you must have some kind of animal, herbivore, in the system within 3 years, or the diseases are going to kind of come in, and it's the animal's guts eating that material that actually we call field sanitation. It's like a sanitation for the field itself. And I thought that was really interesting to hear from him. So again, these are the Nagarin pits and kind of the alley cropping on the right, swales collecting water, and lots of pits and lots of basins so that the ground isn't just flat. And that's what's helping the trees and infiltrating into the soil. On the left, you can kind of see one of our diagrams. We do a lot of diagrams with this. This is from these. We do all of our design in Illustrator, and the plant lists come from the Natural Capital Plant Database. And through that, we build polycultures so that these plants are not only put in. Every tree has nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators and a lot of different perennials wrapped around them. So it's not bare soil. And in many cases, these plants and grasses are put there with deep-rooted plants, tap roots and things like that, because the water is going to be deeper in the soil. And that's where in drought proofing, as we call it, those are the plants we're looking for. Deep-rooted trees, deep-rooted plants in these dry areas that can go down and find the water.
Hey, Dan, we have some questions. One,
sure.
Would chickens count for the animal requirement?
You know what chickens do? They're kind of like goats, right? You don't want to let those goats loose in an area unless they're heavily supervised. They're kind of like marauding clowns. So chickens can work, but they're supervised, like in the sand area. But eventually, they'll start to eat the plants. But as far as manuring and things like that, they're excellent in an agroforestry system. But you would want to keep them, of course, out of your annual gardens and things like that, where they could do a lot of damage. Also, pigeons in dryland climates, which are also part of the systems. Pigeons are very interesting because in the Middle East, that's the major source of fertilizer for farmers over generations, because the pigeons always poop at their roost, which I did not know. And that's what I was hearing from the local people. And that's where they collect, you can imagine, like pigeon manure. But it's very hot, like chicken manure. It needs to be diluted and sprayed very lightly as a fertilizer. So yes, they're great. They help with disease. They help with the pests, all those kinds of things. And just like we put in different plants, there's probably a different chicken for every purpose also, for what you need to have done. And also quail just escapes me. What are those really loud poultry those siren type chickens that everybody gets when the hawks come by? Oh, geez, just
guinea fowl.
Guinea fowl, yeah, exactly, right. Things like that. There are certain things that are a little more gentle on the landscape and more carnivorous and less scratching. So depending upon what you need to happen, the different kinds of fowl, poultry, whatever might work. And they're all the way to ducks, right? Depending on the climate where you are.
And then the person from Utah Valley Permaculture Classroom, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Yes, let me do that.
It's a long one.
It's a long one. Daniel HAlsey, was so nice to meet you 7 years ago. I've been teaching to hundreds of people, Utah, Arizona, everything. And I've been trying to share, as I did at the SWAAN Summit, these examples around the world. I want to ask you.
You have worked with the Utah Valley Permaculture Classroom Gardens Design, because they're saying thank you.
Yes.
For, let's see,
how do I unmute?
Danny, thank you for coming to Utah years ago and helping with our Utah Valley Permaculture Class and Gardens Design School for 100 plus Utah to Arizona landowners who came to design their properties up to 850 acres. They have access to your plant database model, site assessment workbook, and integrated forest design or guilds. We created our own Utah native plant database after 8 years of my research, collecting and planting 150 trees, 37 kinds of berries, herbs, minerals, accumulators, nitrogen fixers, root crops, perennials, and our demo food forest with water harvesting moving systems that work here in Utah to teach students. My mission and question for you is, how can we create a central worldwide website with you, Jeff, Dr. Delu, Elaine Ingham, and all the experts, all the examples of successful regenerative efforts, restoring hydrological cycles, reforestation, etc., and the basic simple how-to for everyone in the world of how they can find indigenous plants, how to set up water systems, and how to start.
The biggest thing, Kelly, thank you so much for reading that. Couldn't find the button. Thank you so much, everybody. I can't tell you how much I love you all, that you are doing this, that we are all doing this together. My big question, Andy and I were talking earlier, everybody keeps giving me the same response. That's just too easy. It's not that easy to fix the hydrological cycle. It's not that easy to cool the planet. And I said, yes, it is, because we remove 50% of our life support systems, and putting them back would fix that. What do you think? What would you tell people, Daniel?
Right. And good question, and thank you for the great advertising.
Thank you.
For the services. So actually, I'm going to talk about that as we move forward to this, but the science is showing, and the research data, and I have some references also, which I like to do, for I'm finding this, is locally and globally, we can make the changes for that. And I do encourage people to work locally, even on their own property. It depends on where you are, of course, but all these changes can be made. The problem, of course, is that the momentum of the global climate change, everything else going in there that other people aren't doing. So it's very tough to make change when you're surrounded by an industry, a culture that's not doing that or continues to cut the trees, all those kinds of things. So it's very, very tough to do that. As far as kind of a one central, people have tried to have one, let's be the one place, right, that fits all this information. I would have to say that I think, the internet is that. And really, you do want to get information from a lot of different sources because there are differing opinions. And a lot of people talk as if their solution is a global solution when we know it's not. If I'm working in Utah or I'm working in Massachusetts, I'm sorry, they don't work the same. The ecology is different. The climate is different. The soil is different. All those things are very specifically different. So all the solutions need to be site specific.
Yes.
So in that sense, that's why I like to speak, and Jeff does too, and John, in principles, right? This is how the ecology works. These are the things you want to work about. Changing the hydrological cycle. We're trying to do that in the Sinai with a group called the Weather Makers in the Netherlands. We've been working on it for years. They're doing experiments. They're doing experiments with growing plants in salt water. We're doing experiments with turning the salt water, extracting the soils that were washed into Lake Botterville, which is in the Mediterranean off of Egypt. The topsoils for thousands of years were washed away into this big lake, so they're all full of salt. How do we extract the salt from this topsoil and get it back on the land, right? That is a very specific strategy that they're working with, and they're actually able now to take these, they really stink, by the way, these sulfur soils, growing saltwater plants in them, which create the organic material, which now we're using to milk compost and get that back up on the land too. So there's strategies for this.
That's
But
beautiful.
like the plant database, people are looking for, what do I do? Can I just punch in my numbers and get a solution? And it's not. And like Bill Mollison would say, you need to live on your land for a year. You need to understand your ecology, right? And you can't force these systems on it. You have to work with it. And I think it's, right, nothing is that easy. Nothing, but you have to, like Stuart Hill would say, who's a professor, I think, in New Zealand, let's get started fast. Let's make our mistakes early and do a bunch of mistakes right away so we get done with that and learn what we're doing right. And
Daniel,
I think that's more the case.
Could I ask one quick thing? I have one student with 100 acres, and he's in Arizona in Concho. And I taught him how to go to the University of Arizona. He found all the native plant database people. He found all the nurseries, and he started working with me with those plants, a lot of them similar to Utah. And we designed his 100 acres with water catchment off the hills to ponds to swales and all these zones of areas that he could put certain plants. And we put them on contour, and he's planted over 500 native trees and plants so far. This is just this year. What I saw was we could teach people how to go to your local people. Even if you're in Africa, go to the elders. In India, that's what Vandana Shiva did. Go to your local elders, find out what the native seeds are, see where you can get them, then find out if you're in America, go to the local landscapers, find out what water systems they know how to do that work well here in Utah. That's what I did here at the school. We set up water harvesting. We brought Brad Lancaster here like we brought you. There is a way to kind of uniformly teach people what kind of steps to take to look for that local vegetation, to look for those local systems that will work, right?
Right. Very regionally and specific to a site, but very regionally, there's usually people that know. People used to ask me about, I want to do a garden. What should I do? And I would say, walk your neighborhood and see who else is gardening. First of all, drive around, see who's got the trees, who's got the plants. And by the way, iNaturalist and Picture This, those apps for the phone, you can easily identify what those plants are and put those in your library. So things like that work very well. But it is true. See who's being successful and start that community like we are with United Designers. Start with a team and start getting your community going and helping with that. So, and by the way, as Paula Westmoreland used to tell me as my mentor back in the early days, Dan, things die. Take it out and start over. Put in a new one. He said we're always trying to work a system, and nature is ruthless. Yeah. So keep moving forward. But really it is water systems, like you're saying, collecting water, building the soil, buffering the extremes of temperature and water, things like that. That's what's really going to help you move forward. Thank you. I'm going to continue here a little bit.
Thank you.
By the way, these are diagrams that we use for different people to kind of explain. This is the succession of an avocado polyculture. This was actually, I believe this was done in Ibiza. I think we've used it in Iraq also, the dry areas. This could be in Southern California, anywhere you want. But the idea is, and I talk about this a lot, you have to get things in the ground. Some things are going to be taken out as they grow, but eventually we're building patches of production that grow together. And that's how forests are made, right? You put things in patches. We keep those patches healthy. We water them. And after a while, they basically grow together, and then they support each other by covering the soil, creating condensation, whatever it might be. And you can see, like, after year 8 of this avocado polyculture, it basically, now you're pruning, you're gathering organic material, even year 3 and 5, right? It's basically a system now that you're managing, and you're harvesting all the different crops, all the different foods, but also you've partitioned the soil, you've increased the soil moisture, you've lowered the temperature of the soil, you also are attracting condensation, and in a sense, you are lowering the temperature of the atmosphere above your own property. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. I keep saying we're going to talk about these things, but we're moving forward, we will. This is what we think of as succession, especially with dry lands. Cover the soil, get the plants in. Whatever will grow, get them in there. And some trees are only taking up space to protect other trees. They call them nurse plants. Whatever you can grow, whether it's mesquite, whatever that might be, get something in the ground that will grow quickly, survive, so you can protect the other plants that are going to be more important over time. So here's another example in Senegal. And again, this is one of those scalable things to talk about. Two different farms, two different areas. By the way, the top picture is based on a late afternoon when the sun's going down on a very hazy day, so it doesn't look, that orange color is very great for enhancing the desert look, but that's not actually, as gray and yellow as you might think it would be. But look at the differences of these areas in management. But also think of this as a scale. If you look at that bottom picture and imagine those aren't eggplants, imagine those aren't beans, but imagine those are trees, right? Imagine those are planted and they are 20 times that scale. It's the same principles. Cover the soil. These are just gone in. You can see they've been cultivating, harvesting in this area. And the difference in the soil color and the difference in the water collection and erosion in that area because they've covered the soil. They also have the bigger trees in back. But this is how we see the scale of putting in a forest. Patch dynamics, spreading out those trees, surrounding those trees with perennials and shrubs to keep the ground cool and also feed them the nutrients they need. Create a lot of organic material on the ground around those trees and let them grow. That's going to help. The bottom left corner, a couple things to think about on this too is patch dynamics is a great thing to study in forest ecology because nature uses patch dynamics to decide what plants go where. And they need a certain amount of density of their species in order for pollination, cross-pollination and such, and also to hold each other up. They also partition the soil with the different kinds of roots, and we do that with our design work. Some are shallow roots, some are tap roots. And the more you partition the soil with different plants with different kinds of roots, a lot of things can grow more closely together and share the soil in the root zones. And then also remember that every transition zone on the forest edge, the trees are going to be different on the edge of that area that you're working in the center. And especially when you're talking of a large area, whether it's 10 acres or 10 hectares, those outer plants need to be the ones that can handle the extremes. The sunlight, the cold, the heat, the rain, all of that. And then the plants and the trees on the inside are the ones that are actually going to be benefit from those trees that are on the transition zone and the borders. But these areas here, by the way, this is we're using the Zaya pits, and we'll have more pictures of that, where the only area that you put the soil is exactly where that plant is. And as you can see in that top picture, they have the Nagarum pits, the holes. They're just holes dug in the sand, filled with compost, manure, whatever it might be, and they hand water these trees. And over time, all those nutrients and all those things start to leach out into the sand. But they don't waste time with mulching and everything all around that sand. It's just right around the tree in the zip drip zone. And by the way, they use little 1 gallon. There's lots of trash in some of these areas, so they use the 1 gallon jugs with little pinholes, so the water just drains down into these holes very slowly. And then you can also see in that picture all the different cisterns. Those are all filled every morning by one farmer, and the rest of them just have buckets and watering cans, and they hand water all these plants. Here's another situation that's very recent, and this is also a great example of restoration in one of the extreme cases that we're working with. This is in Alabama. And I actually just came from here on July 4th when I drove up from here. I've been working for about a year on many different projects. But this is a 2-acre coal chute. This is solid concrete, about 3 feet thick, where in the 70s they used to bring the coal before it was done, conveyored out to barges in the Black Warrior River in Alabama. So the owners had 2 acres of concrete. They wanted to turn it into pasture. The cost of removing, of course, all this concrete was formidable. But even if you remove the concrete, it was basically bedrock underneath it, so you didn't gain anything. And some parts of the country, people would come and basically mine this concrete because they could sell it, but not in this area where they were. So we brought in 3 feet of rock and stone and gravel from an adjoining piece of property that they had. It took them 2 months to do that with a 20-ton excavator, and brought in all the stone and then put gravel on top of that, and then about 6 to 8 inches of topsoil, or basically what they considered topsoil in that area. It's not southern Minnesota, of course. And then planted that with clover, crimson clover, radish, annual rye for the first succession of plants. And this is after that winter. This was last winter, going from nothing to about 2 feet of clover, and the annual rye was fantastically green. everybody was so happy to see this and its success, and people are really happy with that. But of course, what you have to keep in mind is that we work in succession. This is the ground floor nutrients. This is the ground floor organic material. And so next step was kill it all. Okay, now we have to cut it all, get it on the ground, because phase 2 is bringing in the second set of seed crop on here, and that's Bahia seed. It's actually Pensacola, Bahia grass. It's a very dry climate grass, very deep roots, similar, I actually can't say similar, but kind of like vetiver in structure or any of our prairie grasses, very deep roots, very good in high temperatures, so it's going to be their summer grass. So we went in with the cutter, cut down all the clover. It sat there for a couple weeks, and then we went in with the crimper and chain link fence behind the tractor to basically crushed it all down, and then we spread over the summer hot seeds in there, the warm climate seeds, and put that in there. So it went from being this pretty green to then this matted black mess of gray and dead clover and other things in the winter rye. But what's amazing now, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, I forgot to take one before I left, but now all the summer grasses are coming through that and it's greening up again. But this mat, this thatch of all that clover is going to be underneath that grass now, holding the soil, protecting the soil from the rains. And by the way, right before I left, we had 1¼ inches in 20 minutes. And you can imagine what would have happened to all of our soil if it hadn't been covered with this material on that. So now we basically have what is essentially carpeting underneath the grasses. So no matter what happens, it cools the soil, keeps the water, slows it down, and basically gives it a chance to infiltrate before it runs off. So this was a lot of fun, but it also takes a lot of patience in working with that, and also the clients too, because they would love that green clover, and then all of a sudden we kill everything, and they're like, what the hell is going on? Say, well, phase 2. Just wait, later this summer, and by August, we're going to have a nice, lush green grasses again for the pasture. And then we're going to go on to phase 3, which is next fall again. Because as you're probably familiar with, cool season grasses, winter grasses, all those things. Some people aren't familiar with actually these grasses change with every month sometimes, right? Things come and go, and that's what we're trying to build in this case. The clover will be back, the summer grasses will go down, and then we'll have other grasses coming in at the same time.
Dan, can you repeat the names of the deep-rooted grasses that you used?
Yeah, vetiver I really love, but those have to be put in with plugs. We can get those from Florida. I couldn't find a source in Alabama. Vetiver would be a great plant, but that's more of an edge plant, a hillside plant for stopping erosion. Also, it's harvestable for perfumes and things. A wonderful, wonderful plant. But Pensacola Bahia, B-A-H-A-I, grass is a deep-rooted, dry climate class. It's like 100 degrees, and I don't know if you guys have ever been to Alabama, but not a place for a guy from Minnesota. That's for sure. Hot and humid. This grass just loves it, and it excels in that kind of climate, and it's very drought tolerant. So it'll kind of die back in the wintertime, and we have other grasses, and then in the springtime when the hot weather comes and the moisture comes, it pops back again. It's also a great forage plant. It's very good for pasture. So now you have a warm season grass that's going to be coming back. It's very resilient and highly valued by all the locals there for what it can do in the pasture. I think I have that listed in here somewhere too. So that's what it looks like when we went to phase 2. Another thing I wanted to talk about, and this is again what happened to Alabama. This whole area, speaking of forestry now and agroforestry, was mine tailings from the 70s. All the ridges here, Callie's been here. Oh yeah, visited that one time. We walked around last Christmas. This area, because it was mine tailings, it didn't have a lot of topsoil and no nutrients. The trees all had very shallow roots, right? And these loblolly pines were 150 feet tall. They've been there since started in the 70s. So I was there, and actually the house that we ran into for it's kind of a weekly basis with tornadoes down there. They had a direct hit of the tornado right on the property, and they think it might have been 2. And in 3 minutes, all the loblolly pine went down, and there were roots sticking out of the ground all over the place. The things that stayed were the white oak. And the oak trees now are going to be the dominant canopy. And like I say, within 3 minutes, a disturbance came through, knocked over all these pine trees, which have all been harvested and cleared out, piled up, took out a lot of the roots and all the mass on there, and basically opened up the canopy. And now we have what was primarily a conifer canopy, which is now a deciduous canopy of the oaks. And it's very interesting to see that kind of transition. Obviously, the client wasn't very happy with this, but they've actually now kind of warmed up to the fact too that this is what it is. Here's what we're going to do. But this also is when we're putting in our trees and putting in different things, different kinds of roots, right? That's why we really like tap-rooted trees, things that are going to go down and really hold themselves up in a situation where, in this case, we have winds and things like that. A huge change in a very short amount of time there. So, again, no topsoil, no nutrients because it was all subsoil piled up in gravel and stone. So all the trees, except for the oak, they went right down into the stone and they had very strong roots and held up most of that. When I was in Portugal, I saw oak trees that actually grew right into the stone, right into the bedrock. And I was really amazed with that. So there's some really interesting species of oak trees and other trees, of course, too, that are actually could be specifically designed to put in these areas where you don't have good soils, but their roots are really going to dig down and be stronger and not be taken down. I mentioned this when I first was there a year ago, that a lot of these trees have kind of grown past their stability, you might say. And then it was a little over a year later, the tornado came through. It could have been a straight line winds, whatever, and these trees didn't have the stability to stand up. Well, another thing to consider when doing the work here. I want to show this, and I know our time might be getting short, but on the right here are the ziapits. Those are actually pepper plants, and in the back there, eggplant put in. And again, thinking of patch dynamics, thinking of putting in patterns. I'm not a real fan of a grid pattern, but at least they're a little offset in these. Putting in the trees, spacing them well, giving them room to grow so that when they do come up and they do flourish, they have space, and then surround those, of course, with other perennials. But these kinds of things scale up, and you can see in the background with the eggplant, it's all filled in. It's covering the soil. The plants themselves are the ground cover for that and space. And by the way, on the lower right here is some of my reference material. It's kind of long-winded title. These, if you don't mind reading research papers and you can get the vocabulary, this is the proof of what happens in your local area when you put trees in. And Roger Pelkey, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, Senior, he has a lot of different papers about how forestry affects climate, locally and regionally. How adding forests, adding trees can actually increase the rainfall in your area. It also increases the rainfall to your neighbors, but in a sense, it's what a great effect it has, and that's all about climate change too. On the left here, and this comes from work we're doing in Egypt, is in large scale work, how we can get the rains to actually rain closer to an area because it's treed and cooling, and this has to do with the thermal winds and the thermals coming from the ground. You can just imagine, this is more of the papers that we're finding, is that when you put in a forest, that evaporation cools the air, not only up the forest, where we're talking 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 feet in the sky, you're actually cooling the air above the ground. What happens when you cool the air? Water condenses. So you can actually attract rain and vapor to your land by planting it with air cooling plants like trees through evaporation and transpiration. So the winds will change in large scale. You can affect the climate, you can affect the trade winds and the air temperature above the land here. And this is what they're trying to do in Egypt by retreeing the Sinai Peninsula, is to get the westerly winds coming off the Mediterranean to actually all that moisture to actually come down closer to the ground and produce rain rather than being at high altitudes, and it only rains after they're over the mountains. So they need to lower the temperature of the atmosphere on the ground level. Forests do that. If you do some research about Costa Rica and Middle America, Costa Rica is actually having a problem with flooding and getting all the rain because the people around them, all the other countries, are still cutting down their timber. And if you know about Costa Rica, they don't. It's a very forested country. The problem being is all the moisture that goes in the sky from these other countries is actually now being collected in the schools, in the cool skies of Costa Rica. And so now they're getting floods because nobody else, they're getting all the rain from everybody else. So it's kind of interesting science that's happening with climate change. That some places are actually getting too much rain because they're the ones that actually still have the forests.
And we have some questions. We have some questions here. Can the Bahia grass handle 0-degree winters?
I'd have to look at that. It's more or less how deep it freezes with the grasses. It's like vetiver will die back to the ground, but it's a matter of if you have a frost that goes into the ground and kills the roots. So in Alabama, it gets down to 10 degrees. Sometimes it snows, it dies back. But it's more about the root zone and how cold the frost heat goes into the soil and how it affects that. Yeah, they won't die. It's kind of like peaches or things like that too. You might lose a lot of growing space, but they'll come back.
And also another question about establishing silvopasture systems.
Is there a question to that? That's a big topic.
Just
something like that.
Andy, do you want to elaborate? Maybe we'll save that for the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, this is a great way to. I'm going to just shift the camera here a second. This is another diagram which affects us in a couple ways. This is another one from Roger, talking about once you cover the soil with trees, the irradiance of the canopy, the protection of the soil, everything that's lost to the sky when you have bare soil is actually collected in the trees and protected in the soil once it's there. This is from his paper. And I had to put it in just for fun. All these calculations where they use half the alphabet to explain something, it reminds me of plant physiology. Each one of those calculations could probably be done in a graphical representation, which I would love to do sometime. But when you read through these papers, you get to know what all those letters mean. It really makes a lot of sense what they're talking about. The more ground cover you have, the higher the ground cover goes, right? Like trees, shrubs, things like that, you exponentially increase the benefits. So ground cover is great, grasses are great, love it, but they don't do nearly the work that trees and shrubs do in cooling the soil and creating condensation and a small, you might say a micro atmosphere or microclimate on the soil. So in this sense, putting the trees and shrubs over this bare soil or anywhere is really going to affect the climate right there under the trees. And we all know this from walking in the shade. If you cool the air, if you cool the soil, condensation will collect in the nighttime, and especially during foggy days. And it basically, in a forest, most of the condensation is the irrigation. Most of the condensation that creates in a forest is the precipitation over a year rather than the rain itself. It keeps the water in a closed system. This also, I wanted to talk, this is another from his same paper, is it depends upon which trees you actually put in. So the temperate forest, which is mostly deciduous trees, and you can imagine with the leaf surface and the shade that there's a big difference on the effect of the atmosphere in cooling the atmosphere than to say it was a boreal forest or pine trees, right? When you think about it, it makes absolute sense. We have lots of leaf area. We have a lot more transpiration. We have a lot more shade and cooling effect on the ground. Whereas if it's pine trees, there's not so much of that. They're a drier tree. Air flows through them more quickly and the air keeps warmer. So in that sense, where you might have 1,500 feet of effect of cooling the air, it's double that with a boreal forest. It actually goes up much higher with the effect of the heating of the sky. So the clouds are actually lower in a temperate forest than they are in a boreal forest, which means that you get more rain and more possibility of precipitation. So, and this is something I didn't even think about, is which kind of trees we put in. Well, the deciduous trees are going to have a greater effect than the boreal forest trees or the pine trees. And one of my last graphics I want to show, and I wanted to take some time with this too. This is something that needs a little more explanation, but this was our strategy for the Sinai Peninsula, going from nothing to a forest, and what would it take to do that in 5 phases. And generally over 20 to 30 years, depending upon how much money can go in and how many people are there. But really, the idea is, and this is any kind of desert area, whether it's Senegal, whether it's the Southwest or anywhere, is starting with biomass. Some kind of abiotic biomass, even, whatever it might be, it just needs to cover the soil. Bring something in, whatever that might be. Ground covers then would come after that. So you need something that acts as a topsoil, whether it's clay, whether it's subsoil, whatever it might be, to help protect the soils and cover it up. And then start with the grasses and bring the grasses in. This starts to help you with a native soil cover, like you were talking about with the native plants that were in the list, say, for Utah or even Arizona, wherever. That's going to immediately lower the soil temperature, and that's going to help nutrients to infiltrate deeper into the soil. Once the grasses are established, then we come in with the perennials and the shrubs, almost at the same time. That's going to increase the water holding capacity, because we're increasing the buffering of the heat and the sun on the ground. We also start to increase the bacterial soil ecology by doing that. Grasses are a bacterial ecology. Shrubs, trees, mostly trees, are a fungal ecology, and that's what we're working towards. But if we can get the bacteria growing and get the life growing back in the soil with the perennials and the shrubs, then our next phase, let's start rebooting the hydrological cycle by bringing in the trees. So this is over time as this happens. And as it was stated to me too, with, I think it was Neil Bertrando, as we were working on this, he was saying that as soon as you get to that second phase, you have the grasses, perhaps maybe waiting till the perennials after about 3 or 4 years, then you can bring in the livestock. Now it's a silvopasture. Now you have something to eat up all that organic material, and then also start feeding the soil. So it's really great that way. Then bringing in the trees, now you have condensation, now you have transpiration. By the way, I have to kind of correct myself on that, and this is based, you'll see that note in that previous slide. There's evaporation and transpiration. There is no such thing as evapotranspiration. There are 2 separate things, and they are 2 separate systems. So either there's evaporation or there's transpiration, but there's no such thing as evapotranspiration, if you're going to follow the literature and how they want to describe what's actually going on. In this case, too, in Egypt, like I was saying earlier, once you have the trees in there, now you're going to obstruct the trade winds. You're going to bring more moisture, more coolingness to the sky, and you're going to actually lower the cloud cover. Because the thermal hot air from that is now not going up. It's cooler air, and that will reduce the elevation of the clouds and also attract precipitation into this area, and also increase the condensation, which is coming from the trees. This is rebuilding the hydrological cycle. And then as the trees get bigger and more species come in, and as we have it here, the whole goal for the Egyptian government was to get people back on the land. We saw that to be about 15 to 30 years. People are able to now occupy the space because there is resources, there's water, there's a hydrological cycle. And again, if they don't cut everything down, then you might even have animals move back in, birds move back in. We've seen that, and you see that all the time. As soon as there's an oasis of trees, land, water, the animals find it, they smell it, and they move in.
Amen.
And now you have a working ecological system. So this is the diagram that we're using for that, and it is restoring the biological cycle first in the soil, get the soil going, get it alive. Then you can start working on the hydrological cycle as you bring in the bigger plants, collecting more water, getting it in the ground. And we're talking about berms and swales too. There are more physical aspects of this other than just plants. And then the regional climate starts to be more stabilized as this spreads across the landscape, where you're actually collecting water, and now you're building your own hydrological cycle, condensation, rain, and cooling of the air. So that's the last slide I had for you. Happy to take any more questions or go back to any of these two. However you'd like to proceed. You have any more questions, Kelly?
Yeah, so there's a question. It's the slide that was before the how trees make rain slide. Wondering if all of those plants are hand watered from the cistern.
Let me see. Let me go back to that. I was going to just open up all the slides there. Oops, sorry, wrong one.
And then also, how large of an area is necessary to be effective in this restoration plan?
Yes.
You know, really good question. You know, to what effect you're looking at, right? That you're looking to come about. A forest is legally, and this is, you know, it depends on where you are, but I thought it was very interesting that to call anything a forest in the Netherlands, it has to be at least 10 hectares to be a forest. And we call things food forests, and the words are used a lot. But to be effective, right, that's the question, is usually, they say like 1,000 by 1,000 meters is actually, you have to go in a long way to the center before you actually have a forest where all of those energies are working. Because the outside of the forest, the outside edges are still dealing with all the influences from wind and rain and pollution and other things like that before it gets into the forest, where then you have good condensation, cooling, and things like that. The effect of this is basically has been seen is that even on farm scale, 30 to 40 acres has an effect. And especially depending upon your climate, we know this, like in Minnesota, if you have trees, shrubs on your land, guess where the snow falls? It falls on you. When the wind is blowing the rain, trees are like a comb. They basically comb out the rain. And the higher elevations you have, they get more moisture, they condense more moisture. Even where I am today, it was really foggy. You can just imagine all the trees here were just dripping with water. That's precipitation and that's rainfall. If you didn't have the trees, you wouldn't get any of that. So size and density makes a big difference on the effect. Again, if you're alongside the ocean, you have cool breezes like in Senegal. Every morning in that desert area just south of the Sahel, those pine trees are dripping with water. Austrian pine, I think they were. They're just dripping with water on the sand, and they're basically doing their morning irrigation every morning along there. So depends on where you are size-wise, but the more dense trees you have, the more of effect you're going to have.
Another question from Stuart, who says, we have in Tucson an average shade canopy of about 6%. Our goal is to raise that to 15%. Will that suffice to affect the hydrological cycle as you've described?
That's a really good question on a percentage basis, a canopy. We worked in a project in Texas, and they had, I believe it was about 50 acres of forest. They loved it. And that's where they wanted to put and these people wanted to build their houses there. Well, as soon as they punched a hole in the canopy, you create convection and you create a big vent. It's like cutting a hole in your roof, right? Closed canopy is really the key. The more openings you have, and with that, right, air is going to escape, hot air is going to go up, it's going to dry out your plants. So if this is, say you have, 10 acres and you have 50% canopy, is that 50% all in one area, or is it spread over the entire 10 acres, right? Density is the important part of that. Get the trees close together and have a closed canopy as much as possible. That's going to create the cooling area where you're going to get the condensation. If you have it, so that's where you have basically, we have, let's just say 85 to 95 to 100% canopy in this area, great effect. But if you have your 15% and now it's spread over all this acreage, you're not going to have the effect as if it was a closed canopy. And that, I think, is the important part of it, right? Close it up, shade it up. This happened also in Minnesota on another property that had, for 80 years, it hadn't been farmed. Closed canopy, beautiful. And the owner decided, didn't even know this was going on, that he wanted to have it thin. And he hired this logging company to come in and quote unquote thin it. And they basically just chopped that canopy like you would not believe. And they lost all that cooling effect, lost all that moisture. It was all escaping up. So again, it's density. Let's shoot for 100% canopy, right? Over a certain area and let the trees work with each other rather than having them all under stress, right? Now, that being said, and sorry to repeat myself, things need to grow together. So let's just say you plant so that in 5, 10 years, 15 years, taking care of them, they will close together as a closed canopy.
Holly, did you have a question? Your hand was up and then it just went back down.
I just wanted to know, for our CEUs, do you want us to put our number on here?
I believe you're supposed to put your information in the chat and they'll get you on the list.
Okay, thank you.
And then there's a question. I just moved. Information presented is very impressive and speaks volumes in terms of the potential of agroforestry as a restoration tool. What do you think is necessary to increase adoption of the practice in U.S. landscape?
Big question.
Interesting. Let's turn my camera back on here. When I'm working with my homestead clients, my restoration clients, whatever scale they have, and they're looking to do something, the issues we've run into has been in county and state policy. You know, it's amazing. So if you want something to be picked up, and I tell people, practically speaking, if you need to get permits for anything, go to the Department of Economic Development. Don't go to engineering. Don't go to the permitting, anything like that. Make it an economic engine. Something is going to be economic, either the tax base or jobs or whatever it might be. Go to the Department of Economic Development and say, you know what, I want to start this business. I want to do this home, da-da-da-da-da. Can you help me do this, you know? And if that's something that can be adopted, then people will see that as a benefit, right? Working in Haiti, working in all these other areas, and this comes from Common Land. They're also an organization in the Netherlands. And they have the 4 keys to being a successful ecological restoration program. And one of them is, first of all, social, but also an economic benefit. If there is no economic benefit to the local community, they won't pick it up. And many of these areas are across the world, because they're under stress anyway. They're subsistence farmers, and now you're asking them to sacrifice income and all of their calories to do something that you say is beneficial. If you can anyway make it an economic benefit by putting in fruiting trees, vetiver, which can be harvested for animals, or the roots for perfume, find plants that have some kind of economic benefit, and then teach a cultural practice. And a lot of it is changing cultural practices of these areas. Some kind of cultural practice that meets their needs and also the needs of the ecology and the local environment, especially in the watersheds. You can put hundreds of thousands of dollars in and have all this work done, but if it doesn't help the people, all that stuff is going to turn into charcoal within a couple of years. And that's what has happened many times. Project people go away. There's no income for the locals. All they see is charcoal to be sold on the street. So, but being successful is part of it. And with some of the people I work with that want to have teaching farms and they want to like help the world be a better world, model good behavior. You need to have a model farm. Don't talk about teaching to me until you know what you're doing and you have a model successful farm. Right now, today, I'm an heirloomista farm in Minnesota. Kelsey loves farm. She lives in a tiny house. She has a CSA for 15 people, totally off grid. She is doing a tour today for one of my clients from southern Minnesota to help them understand what it takes to garden successfully and intensely, right? So she is actually modeling this. This is her 6th year doing it. And it's so great to be here and see how she farms. That's what we need of. You know, don't focus on the teaching, focus on the modeling. And then you'll attract those people that want to see it.
And then I think it's slide number 16 that was the one in question about if all the plants are getting watered by hand.
That one there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now this is in Senegal, where the average, day pay is like $2. So These are, those square boxes are the cisterns, and these are hand watered with watering cans each day by the farmers. And it sounds daunting, but it's what they do. And this is basically how they teach farming to the local people that they hire. And the expansion of this farm is from getting people to do it well. They find good people, and those people are hired on to help, and they get more work. They get more places to go. But yeah, these are all hand watered. They had, you can't, oh yeah, see that little shack to the far left, right in the center, just below it, all that black stuff? That's their drip irrigation pipe, all piled up, right? That was brought in by an NGO, and they would pump water out of the well, and all those little emitters were plugged within half a season, right? They don't have the technology, they don't have the filtering, they don't understand it. This high-end stuff doesn't work. A watering can, absolutely. And if you want people to limit how much water they put in these plants, make them do it by hand. They're not overwatering these plants, I can tell you that.
Amen.
Right? They're just putting as much as they need to, and they're moving on because they got to walk back and forth to do it. But that's what works here. And that's just like community gardens here, even in the States. No watering hoses in community gardens. One spigot, maybe 20 little watering cans, and people hand water. That makes a big difference in the production and people actually looking at the plants and not overwatering. And we're in sand here too, anyway, for little zaya pits. Does that help with that?
Yes, I was the one that asked that question. I was just kind of considering the dynamics of people in the United States generally, or just in a neighborhood, and just the potential of having them do this manual labor.
Oh, I know, right? In the community gardens, is basically, as I said, if you want people to be successful, and this is the mandala garden. This is a whole nother presentation, but anyway, keyhole beds and mandala gardens, 8-foot diameter. People were growing more food in these little circles than they ever could do in their own gardens, and they were amazed. But it was always intensely gardening, hand watering, all of that, eyes on the ground to make that work. But it's just one of those. To get people to do it. We're really technology based. I'm sorry, can I buy something on Amazon? I need to just have this done, right? That automatically waters all my plants. It's great, but if you don't have filtered water, and of course, and well water is not good for watering. City water with chlorine and all that, that's not good for watering. Rainwater is the best, right? So this is actually well water that goes into these cisterns. There's no chlorine in it or anything like that. And it's in the sand here. It might be mineralized a little bit. But the hand watering is really the way to go. And Nikki, who is here today on her farm, same thing, except she's getting into production. Even Kelsey here, she has drip tape, but she also knows the technology. She knows how it works, and it works well for her because she's doing this. That's her income to do that. So if you want to do that, make the mistakes. There's all sorts of way to do that. There's soaker hoses, drip tape, all those kinds of things. In this case, the hand watering, because they had people, much cheaper to use people, much more progressive to use people than it is to use technology.
Okay. And that is the end of the questions.
Well, thanks, everybody. So if you have any other things that come up, I think there may be a link or emails or however, but uniteddesigners.org is our website. Southwoodsecosystems.com is my website. Kelly's, is it kellybullgardens.com? What is it again?
KB@kellybull.com.
kellybull.com, okay. Right, and other information. I really enjoyed being with you today and your questions, and hope this is helpful in some of the strategies that we've been using in our design work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to get back out there. I'll be in January. I'll be in Lake Havasu, heading out that area. Casa Grande out for that for a while because it's winter. I did my first winter out of Minnesota last winter, and oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I'm destroyed now. It's like that was amazing. So, minus 20 up here, and it was like 60 in Alabama. I was like, oh, that's why people come down here.
Yeah.
But I'll be in Alabama for most of the fall, winter, and then heading out to Arizona and in that area too. So it'd be fun to kind of stop by, even the area, the Southwest Four Corners, whatever it might be. Mobile. This is our roadhouse, mobile roadhouse. I'm full-time RVing now, doing our design work. Heading to northern Minnesota, then hopefully to Vermont and Martha's Vineyard for a couple months before I head south again.
Dan, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoy it. If you can, stick around for the business meeting following this. We have some discussion about the Global Evergreening Alliance coming up.
Sounds great. Just got to check on a couple of things outside, and then I'll be right back. Thank you, Kelly, too. Help moderating.
Yeah, so welcome. Thanks for speaking.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and then we'll move into the business meeting.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.